Here to discuss the war on Ukraine, please welcome Atlantic staff writers Ann Applebaum and Franklin Foer. Here to lead the conversation is the Atlantic's editor-in-chief, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Hi, thank you all for continuing to be here. Haven't seen you in a couple of hours. This is a great opportunity for all of us to hear from two outstanding experts who just happen to work at the Atlantic. Like all great experts, they work at the Atlantic. By the way, have you seen these new pillows that we have? We really, we upgrade this festival every year.
Is it okay
amazing.
if I walk off with mine?
You can walk off with it.
Yeah.
You can take that. Yeah. That'll be your bonus for the year. It's the kind of guy I am. So that's Frank Foer. Frank Foer is the author of, among other things, The Last Politician. This is the definitive book on the Biden presidency so far. I guess you'll have to write a follow-up to make sure that you stay definitive. But it's totally fascinating, and it's, what did somebody just describe it as? Spicy? Surprisingly spicy, given that it's about Joe Biden, right?
You know how hard that is?
Yeah, it's not easy. You get the Pulitzer for spicy writing about non-spicy people. But it's fascinating. We're going to talk a lot about Biden-Ukraine policy. This, of course, is Ann Applebaum, one of the world's great experts on this former Soviet Union, Pulitzer Prize winner, books on the Gulag and the Ukraine famine. Ann and I have done a couple of trips to Ukraine in the last year and a half to see President Zelensky, among other people. Really one of the sort of go-to person for everyone on talking about what's actually going on in Ukraine and what it means. Let me start with you, and then we'll go over to what the administration is doing. But give us, if you can, in 43 seconds, tell us everything that's going on in Ukraine. And you know, this year has been...
And who will win.
Right, yeah. And also, who will win. And also, who will win the presidential election in America next year.
Yep.
You're now down to 38 seconds. All right.
Yep, I got that.
But there's a sense, based on some observable reality, that the Ukrainian offensive hasn't achieved yet what it was meant to achieve. I don't know if that's fair or unfair to judge it in the way it's being judged, but talk about the possibility that Ukraine would have a kind of breakthrough and get through these Russian lines and take back more of its territory. What the possibility of that?
So when you and I were there, which was in March,
In April, yeah.
March, April, people were very, very optimistic. I mean, now they're saying, well, we did never promise we would, break through the lines by the end of the summer, but actually they did think they would. The Ukrainian sort of theory of victory has always been about a kind of asymmetric warfare. You have these big, huge Soviet tanks and, airplanes and boats, and we have itty-bitty little sea drones, and our little sea drones that are packed with the latest technology are gonna break holes in your warships, and our little tiny air drones are going to, confuse and flummox your artillery. And that was meant to be, it was going to be a different way of fighting, and I think on top of that, there was some hope that the new NATO equipment and new levels of training would help the Ukrainians break through what is a really formidable, it's hundreds of kilometers of tank minefields, tank traps, so essentially what the Ukrainians are having to cross is something I don't think any army has probably ever crossed, and the closest thing you come to it is something maybe from World War I. But they did think they could do it. It has been slower than they expected. I think they had hoped for more, but I don't think it's over. Literally as we speak, there's an enormous amount of fighting going on in southern Ukraine.
Right.
And the other piece of the story that's very important is that for the Ukrainians to win and actually for the war to be over, all that has to happen is that the Russians have to go home. So we don't have to conquer Moscow, we don't have to kill Putin, there doesn't have to be a surrender in a train car, whatever happened after World War I. Nothing like that has to happen. All that has to happen is the Russians have to say, this isn't worth it, and we don't want to fight here anymore. So it's what the Soviet Union once said in Afghanistan. It's what, I don't know, the French said in Algeria in 1962. We're done with this war. We're coming home. And so part of what they're doing also is, how do we convince the Russians? So you've seen in the last few days even, they've been targeting Crimea. They hit the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet a few days ago. And so some of this it's almost a psychological game. We want you to say enough.
But the thing we know about Russia, and Afghanistan might be the exception that proves the rule, the thing we know about Russia is that they have endless capacity to absorb pain, as we saw in World War II. I mean, Putin has lost God knows how many young men already. He doesn't care. And they have more people to throw at Ukraine, right? So I mean, it doesn't seem like you can create that much pain.
Nobody has endless capacity. I mean, that's the first thing. I mean, even the Ukrainians don't have endless capacity. And it's also not just about him running out of people. It's also, at what point does he become really afraid he will lose Crimea and be very embarrassed? At what point does Crimea become untenable? How do we? What is the thing that has to happen? What's the what's the defeat that has to be inflicted on them before they say, right, it's too embarrassing. Right. We're going to find some way out of this.
But the problem with all this is, and this is it's a question also for Frank. It doesn't seem, maybe it's plausible, but it doesn't seem probable right now that level of pain will be inflicted on Russia before there becomes a higher level of agitation for Ukraine to settle somehow. And so the question is, are the Ukrainians right now in a mindset, the government in a mindset to say, you know what, Russia just might be occupying 20% or so of our country forever?
So the problem with that, I mean, I even
It's a moral problem. But
so it's not just a moral problem. So the problem with that, and this is, I think there are Ukrainians who would say, do we need Crimea? I mean, they wouldn't say it in public, but who would say that. But the difficulty is that the Ukrainian experience and the experience of others in the region is that you can do a deal with Russia, you can have a frozen conflict, you can sign a ceasefire, and what does that mean? That means that the Russians will go away and they will build up their troops again, and 3 years later, they'll invade you again. And so what the Ukrainians want is for the war to really end, for the Russians, and it only really ends, it ends at a psychological moment. It ends when the Russians say, Ukraine is a separate country, and it's not part of Russia, and we're bored of trying to conquer it. And they could get to that moment. As I said, the Soviet Union did get to that in Afghanistan. The France got to it in Algeria.
Right. What does Biden want?
Well, there have always been these people within the administration, including the subject of your incredible profile this month, Mark Milley, who argued that
You get 2 pillows.
Yeah, thank you. I
want a pillow.
I was playing for 3, and
I got to give.
was
one
that
of the,
too, was that too obvious? Was it too obvious?
She won a Pulitzer Prize. I got to give her a pillow.
Okay. Which, not the Barber jacket in the basement?
No.
Okay. So he had this argument that it was a football metaphor, that the counteroffensive was the offensive line that was pushing through, and that diplomacy was going to be the fullback that was going to shoot through the gap. And on the eve of the last counteroffensive, Tony Blinken went to Kyiv, met with Blinken, and started to really press him on. Zelensky started to push him on coming up with plans for whatever the diplomatic solution would be to the war. And then, of course, that counteroffensive succeeded beyond belief, and there was a sense that another counteroffensive could gain back even more territory. But I think now it feels like we're moving to something that's a nutritional conflict, that we don't even know when this offensive, the counteroffensive, will end. It could extend, the Ukrainians say it could extend indefinitely. It doesn't matter that the rain will start in November, that they have infantry that can keep punching forward, and they're fighting tree line by tree line right now in Zaporizhia. And so that's a very different sort of conflict, and it requires different sorts of capabilities. You need to be able to continue to maintain all of this armor that we've sent to them. You need to be able to produce all of the artillery that is being exhausted, and we don't necessarily have the capability to do that. So it takes a different sort of war plan to pull that off, and I don't know if anybody has necessarily gravitated towards that position.
So stay with this for a second, because obviously, and we talked about this morning with Tony Blinken, the Ukrainians are doing so well, obviously because the Ukrainians themselves are fighting and dying, and fighting heroically, and dying in significant numbers. But they're also still in the fight because the United States is providing them with the weapons with which to fight.
And the Europeans.
And the Europeans. But let's be honest about it. If the U.S. pulled the plug today, it's going to be very, very hard for Ukraine to maintain its position. So what I'm saying is that Joe Biden has a lot of influence over the way this goes. And is there a chance that he will decide sometime in the next 3, 6, 9 months that, you know what, the Ukrainians are not going to achieve their vision of a perfect ending to this war. So, you know what, I'm going to have to start moving them. I mean, you know, and Milley floated.
Can I just say, the only problem with that is they need someone to negotiate with. In other words, you need the Russians to want to end the war. And right now, there isn't any indication that the Russians want to end the war.
So we could be in a situation
the Russian goal is the same as it always was, which is to conquer Ukraine.
Right.
And I think Biden agrees with that. But he uses a metaphor to explain, in a global sense, the Ukraine war, which is that there are 3 clocks that are simultaneously ticking down. One of them is the Russian clock. When will they get to the point that Anne just described, where they give up, right? Because to launch another offensive requires another mobilization, because whatever the reasons are that Russia ends up deciding that it's not worth it. Maybe it's just too embarrassing. You have the Ukrainian clock, which is that this war exacts an incredible cost on the Ukrainian people, on the economy, just the number of dead. I think that there's some evidence that Ukrainians, the sort of unity that's permeated the country through the first part of the war could dissipate at a certain point. And then the third clock is the domestic clock, where in Europe and in the United States, support for the war is going to, could run down at some point. It could be what causes this government shutdown and becomes the major flashpoint there.
Is that the same clock as the doomsday clock, which is that Donald Trump beats Joe Biden?
Yeah.
That's the same.
It is.
I mean, but
it could be.
No, you're talking about one is evolutionary and one would be revolutionary.
Yeah.
The evolutionary changes, the American people gradually grow tired of spending all this money or however it's framed, and then want this thing to come to an end. The revolution would be when Joe Biden, when Donald Trump pulls out of NATO.
Yeah.
And switches sides.
Yeah.
I mean,
and the only way to future-proof yourself against that is to achieve a sort of definitive victory on the battlefield before then, or to against the odds, broker some sort of solution.
Let me ask Ann that question. NATO, on the one hand, Zelensky on the other. How much are they thinking? How often are they thinking about the American electoral clock right now?
All the time.
What do you hear?
I mean, people are very delicate about it, as I'm sure, Tony Blinken was this morning.
He's delicate about everything.
No, I mean, some of it is, if you say this to, for example, a British person, they'll cover their ears and they don't talk about that. Don't upset.
You mean the idea of that?
The idea of Trump
here.
coming back,
right?
And specifically in this context, they're less worried about our internal issues and bad things that would happen here. They're more, but everybody gets the danger to NATO and to, it's because actually the role that the U.S. plays is not just that we give them weapons or we give them money. I think actually the Europeans give them more money. It's that the U.S. plays the galvanizing role. We run the meetings. We have the biggest, the best intelligence. Sort of if you took the U.S. out of the equation,
right.
And that would be difficult for in other lots of areas as well, not just in Ukraine. And it's very difficult for people to think about because it's it's an unimaginable end to a set of assumptions they had about the U.S. all along. I mean, having said that, the first Trump term was somewhat better than expected, partly because the current Secretary General of NATO, who's a very smooth Norwegian, Stoltenberg, who I wrote about in The Atlantic recently, was so good at managing Trump. And he was polite to him. He welcomed him to NATO. Here's your home in Brussels, Mr. President, kind of thing. But he famously, he realized, okay, Trump is obsessed with numbers. NATO's not paying enough money. So he's a former economist, and so he created a lot of charts. And he would show, I'm not making this up, and he would show big charts. Here's the chart showing European military spending going up since you became president, Mr. Trump. And it was, And it was, and maybe there's some form of diplomacy that keeps Trump on side. I mean, the other weird factor that I don't know how to process is, does Trump want to be a loser? He wants to end the war and see the crushing of Ukraine. I mean, is that going to look good for him? I don't know. His mentality is so weird.
He's done, like in Syria, he's happy. There are all sorts of instances where he's willing to let somebody else lose if it's not him. I don't think that he especially cares about that. I think one thing that you hear the Ukrainians say now about Biden is that they wish he was doing more to make the political case for U.S. support for the war.
Inside the United States.
And that's always been a source of tension because Zelensky has this ability to speak over Biden's head to the Western public, to Congress, in a way that Biden doesn't especially care for because it's somewhat embarrassing to him. He's constantly being pressured. And of course, that's the nature of their relationship. It's symbiotic. It's that Biden needs Zelensky to push in order to be able to deliver the packages.
Go into their relationship a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a very complicated relationship because if you remember, Biden, when he first met Zelensky came to Washington in September of 2021. He was traumatized by everything that he'd experienced during the Trump years. Hunter Biden was actually kind of the source of that embarrassment because that's what they were pushing him to dig up dirt on.
Oh, Burisma.
Yeah, on Burisma. And Biden looked at Zelensky and said, "You're a comedian. I've been involved in Ukrainian politics much longer than you are because I had the Ukraine portfolio during the Obama administration." And Biden is able to relate to fellow politicians, and he looked at Zelensky as kind of an amateur. And Zelensky performed really badly in his first Oval Office meeting with Biden. And he had reasons to be upset with Biden because Biden had ended the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, and Biden hadn't been especially forceful when Russia had built up troops in April of 2021. But Zelensky came in and started pushing for NATO membership, and Biden told him that's never going to happen. And then Zelensky started talking about how even the French and Germans didn't want to be in NATO, and Biden just walked out of the meeting thinking the guy was an amateur. And then over the course of the next couple months, Biden is continually pushing him to take the intelligence about the impending invasion seriously. And there's no evidence in those meetings that Zelensky is responding with all the steps that we're advocating that he does. And so then during the first week of the war, they're expecting Zelensky is going to get assassinated, or they'd been pushing him to develop continuity of government plans that they never saw. The State Department had begun drawing up plans for a government in exile. But this relationship is always tense. The Ukrainians never share everything that we want them to share. They're suspicious. They worry about leaks. They come from right.
How's their relationship right now? Is it better than it's better than it's
been?
It
matures. Yeah, it's a matured relationship where there continues to be tension because they're simply not totally aligned in their interests or tactics.
Right. Maybe you could explain one thing that's always a mystery to me. We go through this pattern. I don't know how many times we've done this pattern where the Ukrainians ask for a particular American weapon system, and then we say, no way, it's never going to happen. Then the next week there's an announcement that we're sending them that weapon system. Does that show like a kind of hesitation, enthusiasm, kind of bipolar loop or something? What is that?
Yeah.
What is the source of that?
I think Biden, when Biden walks into a meeting about Ukraine, his question that he always asks is, if we give them this weapon system, will it lead to Russian escalation? I think over time, it's become clear that Russia isn't going to escalate in response to us giving them what they ask for. But I think Biden always has that hesitation going in, and then there's no science to knowing how Russia will respond to something. And then it becomes clear over time that all this talk about giving them F-16s or MiGs or whatever it is doesn't cause Russia to really overreact in any sort of way, and it becomes more comfortable for him to sign off on it. And also the pressure works. Zelensky's pressure on Biden tends to work. Members of Congress call Biden and they push to get the systems delivered. The Europeans start to push, and his resistance melts.
Right. And last word to you. This, and Frank refers to this anxiety, legitimate anxiety on the part of American administration and all of NATO, that at a certain point, Russia will feel so aggrieved or so put upon that it would do something that we would consider insane. Obviously, it's an enormous nuclear power. That governs so much of this dynamic. Where do you come down on that question? Do you think there's over worry about it?
So I do now think there's over worry. So I mean, you have to be careful because there's not a non-zero chance. I mean, there is always some chance that the Russians would do something. I mean, you can't just, there's always some chance we would invade Canada, and there's always some chance that, I mean, you know what I mean? There's
a higher chance we're going to invade Mexico, by the way.
Yes, very likely, maybe even. Anyway, so there's always a chance. When people started to game it out, what could the Russians do if they used a nuclear weapon? What would the reactions be? Where could they do it, and how could they do it? If you think, for example, anywhere they used it on the battlefield, wind blows to the east and radiation blows into Russia, and a lot of Russian soldiers die. Okay, they could explode one in the air. So that was an idea that they might do that.
Just a show.
What's just a show? They could take out a Ukrainian city. As soon as they do that, a lot of other things happen. They lose their support. The Chinese have been both publicly and privately very clear that they don't want nuclear weapons used. We have been very clear publicly and privately that we don't want nuclear weapons used and that there will be a response. I don't know how. I've heard various versions of how that would look like, but I don't know how granular we were with the Russians, but there would be the word is catastrophic response. So they have it's a very high bar for something that would not necessarily win them the war.
Right.
Even if they destroy a Ukrainian city, then the war's not over. The Ukrainians have iodine pills, and they keep them in their in their wallets. I mean, it's hard to see how there's a logical way to do it.
And I know we have to go, but let me reframe that question. If the U.S. were to do more, defined however you want to define it, you don't think that would push Russia to the red line, or that an actual Ukrainian punch through through the Russian lines would not provoke that kind of Russian response?
The Ukrainians have punched through Russian lines several times already. There've been, there was the victory in Kiev in the spring of 2022. Then there was a huge victory a year ago in Kharkiv, and then later Kherson. So they've done it. There has been successful counteroffensives already, and none of them.
Right.
We hit large warship and a submarine that were sitting in the Sebastopol harbor. That didn't create it. We hit the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. That doesn't do anything. The level of response that they can, the revenge they can exact from Ukraine, they've already done. I mean, they've already used cruise missiles to hit, Ukrainian hospitals.
Right.
So.
Well, to be continued. This is fascinating and enlightening. Thank you to both of you. I'll steal the pillows tomorrow. We'll leave them here for now. But I want to thank you both for coming. Thank you all, and see you soon.